is part of, like nature, like music, like everything in creation, is part of the created world, and the created world constitutes in its particulars what in Islamic theology and law we call a dalil, or plural adilla. So, shall I write the word? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
Or just in case, yeah. Now, this is a very core, simple, but yet critical, because singular is dalil, plural is adilla.
Oh, guidance, is it?
Right.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And the root word is dalla, right? Actually, well, the root word is dalla, and then the shadda takes the place of the original three-part root with dallala, but then an L is excluded and replaced by shadda. But this is, I mean, we don't need this final point. But the critical notion is to guide, right? An indicator, a pointer, something that points. And in the Quranic discourse, and as well as in the prophetic tradition, creation itself, in its micro manifestations, constitutes various adilla, indicators pointing to the truth of the divine. And what is the Quranic concept for engaging the dalil or engaging these indicators? Well, the Quranic concept is nazar, which means to observe, to look, right? Or tafakkur, reflection, right? Comes from the word fakkara, to think. Or, even more importantly, tadhakkur, from the word dhakra, remembrance. Right? Tadhakkur, from the word, comes from the root dhakara, to remember. And so the whole dynamic, the Quranic dynamic, is observation, reflection, remembrance, would, as to the created world, al-alam al-makhluq, or the khalq, right? God is known as the khaliq, the creator, and the created is the khalq. Would then present human beings, not Muslims, but human beings, with a critical and decisive, not decisive, but a critical, a pivotal posture or position where they are placed in a as if this engagement with the indicators, with the dalil, then places them in a pivotal normative position where they must engage their will in one way or the other, and quite simply, the critical word in Islamic theology is shahada or shahada, right? To witness. And that's why, for instance, as you know, the very first pillar of Islam is ashhad, right? I bear witness that there is no God but God and Muhammad is the Prophet of God. But importantly, is that this shahada, this witnessing, it is not, as we would know intuitively, it is not it is not similar, or it is not in its nature parallel to, perhaps it's not, I shouldn't say similar, but it's not parallel to bearing witness in law, right? Because in this process of engaging the adillah of the created world, you are you don't actually observe the ultimate end goal, you don't observe the ultimate objective, but through the mediation of remembrance, reflection, observation, you gain a condition of knowledge. And this knowledge in its gradations, its ultimate level, basically the word ilm, right? I-L-M. You gain knowledge, and then in its ultimate is yaqeen, certitude. Now, here, yaqeen, the word, so for instance, the Quran tells us, God speaking to the Prophet Muhammad, it says, فَعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى يَأْتِيكَ الْيَقِينَ. Worship your Lord until you achieve certitude. So, it is, the text could have said until you achieve فَعْبُدْ رَبَّكَ حَتَّى تَأْتِيكَ الشَّهَادَةِ, until you could bear witness. But yaqeen, certitude, is beyond knowledge, it is certain knowledge, right? And for instance, again, the Quran, when speaking about hellfire, in one passage, for instance, says, كلا لو تعلمون علم اليقين لترون الجحيم ثم لترونها عين اليقين. Only if you had your full senses developed, only if you truly knew, you would have attained certitude. You would have reached certitude. But then it tells us that, well, what is it that the certitude that we will attain? So here in the passage that I just quoted, it's talking about the notion of hellfire, or the notion of punishment, the notion of paying for your, being held accountable for your sins. And it says, كَلَّا لَتَرَوْنَّهَا عَيْنَ الْيَقِينِ. So you now will have an opportunity which you didn't have on earth to observe it, to see it with your eyes, and your eyes will be the door to your certitude. And that is the difference between the other world and this world, is that the other world, you will deal with the metaphysical, the barrier between the physical and metaphysical completely collapses, and the one can lead to the other without trial or tribulation. You don't have to work hard to breach that barrier between the physical and the metaphysical. But but on this earth, in this world, you are asked to attain knowledge not just about the physical, but even more importantly, the whole notion of Allah and so on, about the metaphysical, and doing so on this earth is by its definition is process of struggle. Right? It's a struggle. It is, and the indicator in the Quran to that is too numerous. You know, إنك كادح إلى ربك قدحا فملاقيه, that you will be tested. You will in fact labor until you will see your God ultimately, without doubt. But on this earth, trials and tribulations take you all types of directions, and the shahada is an acknowledgement that the goal is for your theoretical knowledge to become one and the same with your certitudes, with your realized knowledge, with your fulfilled knowledge, your actual knowledge, as they would put it in Islamic theology. And so you would have no doubts anymore. Okay, now let's pause for a second and say, okay, remember we said in the Puritan paradigm, submission, the space for submission is occupied by all these physical practices. And building upon what there was a medieval scholar known as a Tahawi, who was an Ash'ari, but a school of thought within the Ash'ari school of thought, who developed the distinction between Tawheed al-Uluhiyyah and Tawheed al-Rububiyyah. Basically, al-Tahawi laying, and it's not Ibn Taymiyyah, ironically, because I'm going to talk about the difference between Tahawi and Ibn Taymiyyah in a second. But Tahawi, the Puritanical creed, the Wahhabi creed, is often known as al-Aqidah al-Tahawiyah. If you read the Surah, often they refer to al-Aqidah al-Tahawiyah, meaning the Tahawi school of thought. And Tahawi fundamentally said that we cannot know what is in the hearts of people. We can only judge by their external behavior. And in fact, saying, but people are deceptive and tricky, right? That they might put on appearances, put on airs, they might pretend to be pious, but they're not. So he says that everything on this earth, all affairs on this earth must be managed according to a particular type of shahada, particular type of, and let's now use, instead of, I'm going to use shahada and knowledge interchangeably, okay? According to a certain degree of knowledge. it would, fascinatingly, it is what we would call now, today, material knowledge, a predecessor to a theological existentialism. So he says, basically, I judge, or I would measure whether someone is a real Muslim or not a real Muslim by the number of times that this person prays in the mosque, or the number of rak'ah. And he says, well, because human beings are deceptive, space for innovations is very dangerous, so all practices of submission, how he concedes that submission is ultimately not a physical state, but an epistemological condition of submission is knowledge. But he says, but there is no way on this earth that this world doesn't really have a way of measuring the, we'll call it, he actually uses the word al-khariq lil-'ada, what we translate as a paranormal, right? Al-khariq lil-'ada, that is against what is customary. And then he says, so basically then people must trace their manifestations of submission to text, and the text gives me an indication, a dalil, of authenticity, and then the application of the normative commands of the text is again my dalil as to the real condition of this human being, and so on and so forth. And this is why, if you know, in one of my writings, I talk about the relationship of Wahhabis to materialism. Remarkably, and you sense this if you go to Saudi Arabia, and there is, for all their Puritanism, Wahhabis are very oriented towards materialism in this world and in the hereafter. So in fact, Tahawi says, and remember, Tahawi is what Abdul Wahhab basically co-opts for the Wahhabi theology. It says that, we human beings, our ability to know or to know anything depends on our senses. The touch, hear, see, smell. And so it would be unthinkable that God would reward us in the hereafter in ways that would shortcut our senses. Our very definition of human beings is materiality in this world, and even in the hereafter we enjoy. And so Tahawi's vision of, as very much of the Wahhabi vision of heaven, is very material, right? Sex is going to be actual sex. Alcohol is going to be actual alcohol. Honey is going to be actual honey. This materiality is arises from his fundamental notion of his fundamental suspicion directed towards human authenticity, he says when human beings claim reason or claim intuition or claim enlightenment, as in so most of the time they are doing nothing but deceiving themselves. And he would have fitted, I think, rather fitted very well in the modern age as a, hard-nosed skeptics so he says, well, how do I account for the fact that, the non-materiality of God, this is why Al-Tahawi ends up with the notion that the Wahhabis actually spent a lot of time trying to avoid. Tahawi ends up with the idea of tajseem. Does anyone know what tajseem means?
Not like anthropomorphism or something.
Yes, that's it. The materiality of God. So Tahawi ultimately ends up with the idea that God, trying to reconcile this material versus how could we live in such a material world, be so dependent on our material senses, but yet attain shahada, knowledge as to a non-materiality, a metaphysical. So Tahawi says, well, you know what? It is ultimately, God is a material being. God has hands, eyes. So when the Quran speaks about the hand of God over their hands, or that God sees, or whatever, how he then adopts this notion of tajseem completely. Interestingly, Ibn Taymiyyah, who comes after Tahawi several centuries, doesn't agree with Tahawiyah in many levels. Although there is evidence to suggest that Ibn Taymiyyah went as far as accepting tajseem. I mean, some of the texts actually Ibn Taymiyyah seems, but ultimately even Ibn Taymiyyah says there is a confusion here between the functions of law and the realities of faith. As a matter of law, tracking authenticity of belief, or tracking whether someone had an intent or not, is relevant. But in matters of faith, this obsession with a proof confuses between human beings as judges and as judged. That in effect, Ibn Taymiyyah is saying Tahawi, whether he wishes it or not, ends up sitting in judgment over the faith of all others, because he's measuring their compliance with the text and saying, okay, you're a true Muslim, you have true Tawheed, or you have false Tawheed. And Ibn Taymiyyah actually, in quite explicitly in his Minhaj al-Sunnah, says, but who has this function? Who performs this function? Remember, Ibn Taymiyyah, one of the reasons that he even deconstructs the notion of khilafah is because Ibn Taymiyyah himself is a rebel, and himself is very suspicious of government, of power, of authority. I mean, he spent most of his life in prison as a political prisoner, right? So Ibn Taymiyyah says, okay, even the Prophet, whatever he knew about people's pieties, he knew by revelation, not by material evidence. And the proof of this is that the Quran, God tells the Prophet that there are hypocrites, and tells the Prophet, you don't know them, but I, God, know them, right? God speaking to the prophet says, well, you don't know the hypocrites, but I do. And at times, God even tells the prophet, watch out for the hypocrites, and so on. So Ibn Taymiyyah points out to the tradition of the prophet and his refrainment from judgment as to the truth of the existence of faith or the lack of it, except when there is legally relevant issue. So if there is no issue, if there's an issue of inheritance, for instance, Ibn Taymiyyah says, well, we might then look into whether this person was an actual Muslim or not, but or it's issue of citizenship, whether someone belongs to Islamdom or Christendom. But other than that, to even speak with this type of with this existentialist perspective is dangerous, because it implies that there is an authority that is deputized with keeping track of the pieties of people. And Ibn Taymiyyah quite explicitly says there is no such authority except God in the hereafter. And he says that even the Islam can exist without Khilafah, and this is one of Ibn Taymiyyah's truly radical notions, that the Khilafah is not core to Islam and so on. And that's why the Wahhabis, for instance, are very don't like the Hizb al-Tahrir, because Hizb al-Tahrir want the Khilafah, right? They want the Caliphate. The Wahhabis say, the Caliphate is not important. However, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab does something which he takes some elements of Ibn Taymiyyah, but mainly upon the theology of Tahawi, builds his theological perspective, and in a very austere, right? Very austere, very physical, existential, not even just textual, but Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab basically condemns as false shahada, as false knowledge, anything that any attempt any ma'rifah, any epistemology that is not thoroughly dependent on the concrete, either something I can measure or weigh, or a text I can read, but reason, imagination, ecstasy, so on. So Abdul Wahhab, in his famous Risalat al-Tawheed, says, he says, when these Sufis, I watch these Sufis and they are saying Allah, Allah, and swaggering back and forth, they say Allah, but how do I know? As far as I'm concerned, they might as well be saying Shaitan. They might as well be calling the name of the devil, because it's not textually based. So they could be doing this, and as far as I'm concerned, they could be thinking of erotic images, or thinking of what they're going to have for dinner, or what and so Abdul Wahhab says, well, this space, and Abdul Wahhab seemed to see the space as dangerous upon society. This unregulated space as rather dangerous for society. I mean, his main accusation against the Sufis and against the rationalists, against the spiritualists and rationalists is what? Is, they're bringing in innovation, something, fitna, right? The notion of fitna, this critical word. Fitna would best be translated as what?